Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Going Digital Behavioral Health Conference. Today, we're going to be covering a panel focused on designing a product for the mental well-being of our users. We've got a great set of panelists that have joined us, and we're grateful for. My name is Anish Srivastava. I'm CEO of Vinaj Ventures, an innovation investment services firm. We launched a fund called Velocity a couple of years ago, focused on early stage investments in startups that are focused on improving mental well-being for young people. Today, we have Rita Fabi, who's a consultant and advises clients on ways to build positive online communities. Previously, she was the online safety director at Facebook, which included work supporting youth mental health and well-being. We're followed by Dama, who's a CEO and co-founder of Manatee, a family-first mental health care company designed to help kids thrive in the modern world. She has over 10 years of experience in high-growth startups and lives across the world. And then we have Mercedes, who's a clinical psychologist and chief clinical officer at Manatee, designing evidence-based programs for kids and families. She has extensive experience working with children and families with expertise in mood disorders, child abuse, and foster care, and cultural responsive treatments. We are also joined by Alana, co-founder of Flipped and chief marketing officer, a social productivity app for high-achieving students, where she's spent the last 5 years building a community of nearly 2 million users, tackling digital wellness and productivity. Thank you all for joining us and being here. I am going to kick off the panel with the first question, which I think is on the mind of a lot of folks. What questions should decision makers be asking to keep users' best interests or values in mind? So Alana, would you like to start?
Absolutely. This is something that we're constantly asking ourselves as a company. Even just this morning, got out of a product meeting where we're talking about what we should be doing with a feature that isn't getting the use that we were looking for, and whether or not that's a problem with the feature or it's a problem with the value that the feature is providing the users. And so sometimes I think that as decision makers, you have to take a step back when you're taking a look at your products and what it is that you're designing, and really looking at the user persona, the user profile, like what really did that person come here to accomplish? And is your product really helping them achieve that goal? Or is it helping you achieve a different goal that might be different from your users? And if it's not quite achieving that goal, or maybe it is, what could it be doing differently or doing better? And also thinking about what are your users' short-term goals and what is your business's short-term goals, and then what are the long-term goals. So a lot of times we get stuck in thinking about users that, because especially we run a mobile app, and so some of the challenges is dealing with our funnel when we have a new user coming in, and how do we make them sticky? What do we need to be doing to make them stick around? But if you really are thinking a lot more about creating value for the user from the very first point of entry, even when they're just engaging with your brand, like on your website, is your messaging right? Are you giving your users the right product? You're connecting the right type of user to the right product. These are like just a handful of questions that we ask ourselves on a regular basis. And you have to be, I think, really embedding that into a cycle of your product decision making. So starting at the very beginning of your product's design process and development process.
Thank you, Alana. Mercedes, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, Alana, I loved what you said. And I think, are we engaging the right user? So what is it that they need in that moment? And short-term and long-term, like you were saying, and really thinking, are we the best fit right now? Can we develop something that's a better fit for what they're looking for and what they need? And when possible, even using assessments and measures to see what is it that they really need right now, specifically when we're thinking about mental health and how broad that can be. Is it treatment that they need right now? Do they need therapy? Could they use something else? How can we best support them for what they need?
Thank you. Thank you, Mercedes. So that brings us to another interesting point, which is what have you learned that motivates positive behaviors for your users, and what ultimately improves outcomes? Alana?
So on that, note, moving from what are the questions that we're asking our users, for us, something that we learned that sort of seems like it shouldn't come as a surprise, but it's one of those things that I think a lot of companies fail to recognize, is that really encouraging and fostering like a positive brand voice. So speaking from a really positive sort of like the way that we're communicating with our users in every level. So this is, for example, like we used to have an Instagram account that was all about like sort of humor for our audience, because we deal with a younger audience, typically between the ages of around 18 to 24 is our user base. A lot of it is actually women. And so we thought that our audience was really engaging with humor. But then we shifted our entire sort of brand voice to be educational and motivating and inspiring. And what we found was that actually helped our audience engage with us on a much more meaningful way. And the way that we had shifted our brand voice actually started translating into the product and the copy that we were using. And so a lot of time you don't think of these like high level things, like how your users are engaging, even with something as small as like an email or a welcome message, things like that. And so it's almost like if you speak from a positive perspective, your users will engage with you in a similar way. And that's just something that we found kind of a surprising and great learning experience that we've had over the last couple of months.
Very helpful. Dama, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very similar to everything that Alana has already talked about. But what research for us, we're really focusing on child mental health and family mental well-being. And what research also shows is that positive reinforcement works much better when it comes to changing behavior. So what we really focus on, even thinking around parenting, right? Like punishing your kid doesn't work as well as positive reinforcement. And we really focus with all of our messaging in that. So when we're thinking about therapy, what are some of the goals that we can set, and how can we make it super engaging and motivational for kids to achieve those goals? And then reward them for like their hard work in a variety of ways. That can be, giving the parents tidbits on like, this is how you praise your kid once they've done something really great, or praising within the actual experience of the platform or the app, similar to what Alana is saying, like being really motivational, like saying how great they're doing for putting in their hard work. And then finally, we do it even to the extent of like they're accumulating basically points, like gamifying that process, and then they can redeem those points for fun rewards with their parents, kind of building connection, but also rewarding them for the hard work that they've put in. So all to say, I think what really drives positive behavior is also acknowledging the positivity and focusing on that positive reinforcement and making ultimately your users feel good.
Yeah, there's a lot of lessons there to learn for my kids as well there, Dama. So thank you for that. This brings us to another question, which I think, Rita, would be great to hear your perspective. What are potential unintended consequences if we don't focus on user safety and well-being?
I think it's a great question. And I would advise companies as they're building new products typically these companies are coming in from a really positive perspective and really are mission-driven companies looking to create positive change. And when thinking about your mission and some of the features that you're putting in place, think about unintended consequences, as you said, in doing so. So for example, if we think, I used to work at Facebook, and if there's been a lot of discussion about Facebook in the media in this case. And I think one thing we could look at is the positive of really the mission being to connect people. That does make people feel more connected to others and can make people feel less lonely. But the unintended consequence might be when people feel like they're not connecting to people, or if they're seeing people at a party that they weren't invited to. So these are things that ended up being unintended and creating some feelings of loneliness or isolation, when really, in fact, the intention was to really create connection. So I would advise companies to really be thinking, even if we're going in with the best of intentions, to really think about what the opposite outcome might be. The second thing I would recommend to anybody is when they're creating products to really build safety from the start. So to really think through, how do you build a product or a feature that's thinking through potential scenarios where your company can provide help and support if something were to potentially go wrong.
Super helpful. Thank you, Rita. From a Manatee perspective, how do you look at it, Dama?
Yeah, I think kind of to synthesize everything that Rita has said, how we think about it is a kind of, what is your goal and what are vanity metrics? And I think a lot of times tech companies, any company, create these vanity metrics like engagement or the number of sessions or all of these things where you're questioning like, well, what is the end goal here? Where instead of really thinking about, okay, in our ultimate goal is, right, like how can we make sure that families feel better, connect deeper, have meaningful relationships, that kids have the tools to build resilience. So we actually don't really look as much at like, okay, we want to have like a really high number of sessions, or we really want kids to kind of like log in continuously. What we really want to look at, okay, well, how many goals can they achieve? Goals really relating to like them learning a skill, or them finishing a lesson, or them doing something great, or how many rewards have they quote unquote redeemed? So how many kind of meaningful experiences have they had with their families? And then obviously at the highest level that Mercedes is really passionate about, like, well, what is actually their outcomes, right? Like, is anxiety decreasing? Is depression symptoms decreasing? Are they feeling better about their life, school, their friends, their family? So I would just urge companies to think about like, is this a vanity metric, or is this actually something that means something meaningfully? Because that's what you're going to optimize your product development around.
That brings us to the next question, which is, how do these decisions differ when you're providing services to kids versus adults? Rita?
The first thing I would advise a company to think about is really the regulatory issues surrounding providing services to kids, whether you intended to or whether kids ended up finding out about your service and now they're using it. But there's definitely regulatory issues, so definitely look into that immediately if you know when you're building your product or your service. The second is more on a marketing side or communication side, but when developing materials or a user experience flow that's really geared towards kids, usually the people who are making it are not kids. So we're going to be typically, we might be young adults, but we're adults. And so it's really important to understand what will resonate with kids, speak in their language, understand how to really connect with them. So whether that's through focus groups with them, or doing quantitative research with kids, or working with people who work directly with kids, for example, therapists or teachers, it's really important to engage them to get their feedback in order to ensure your work is relevant to them.
Thank you, Rita. And Mercedes, from a clinical perspective, how do you look at this?
Yeah, so from a clinical perspective at Manatee, so the child is the client, but the parents are also a really key component. So we want to involve the parents whenever possible. We know it actually leads to better outcomes. So that's a very big focus. And at the same time, there's this tension between building the autonomy and self-efficacy in the child, and also looping in the parents and respecting that trust that you build with a therapist and confidentiality, and knowing when you're going to break that confidentiality to share with the parent. So having very clear policies with the child and letting them know. And also, we're talking about children, but that's a really big age group. So a child that's 8 developmentally is very different than one at 17. And so you're, like Rita was saying, you're creating content for very different people, very different just needs and developmental and cognitive stages. So having that in mind is really important. Then something else we're really focused at Manatee too is we don't want to push more screen time for just the sake of engagement. We really want to be mindful on how much time kids are spending on screens and being useful time, and helping use our platform or other engagements so they can actually engage better in the outside world, not so they're just more focused on their phone.
Okay, great. So that brings me to the next question. How do you balance risk as a company versus doing the right thing for users? Alana?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is a really good place to end up after all of the things that we've discussed here is that if you are an early stage company, or maybe you've been around for a couple of years already, and you're starting to really see the impact of what it is that you're building, I think value creation is going to be what really accelerates your growth over anything else. So to me, it doesn't, like, creating value for your user, keeping your user top of mind, making sure that everything that it is that you're doing is ultimately for the better benefit of your end user, is not a risk. Like, you're not taking a risk by doing that. That's been my experience in a consumer space. We don't face as many risks as building a product in the medical space. Probably very few risks in comparison, but I definitely think that just always focusing on value creation is ultimately going to be better for your business, your bottom line, and your brand altogether at the end of the day.
Thank you for that. And Dama?
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I also have a different perspective because we're obviously providing mental health care for kids. So they're like the two components that carry the most risk almost. So, but having said that, I think because we're really currently dealing with a mental health crisis for kids, right? Like, you can't really go around it anymore. So I think what we really focus, and not I think, I know what we're really focused on is actually ultimately doing the right thing, even if that carries more risk. Because I think if you do it the other way around, you end up providing a service that is just going to be around risk mitigation and like trying to, not be liable, which is what a lot of tech companies and providers do, rightfully so. And I completely understand that too. But we really kind of flipped it around, be like, okay, let's focus on doing the right thing. The right thing to do is to identify kids when they need help, to know if they're suicidal, to make sure that we pick those things up. And then we can think about, okay, well, now how do we mitigate risk? If we have all that information and if we feel like that's the right thing to do, there are ways that we can mitigate risk. We can be really clear in our communication plan to both parents, kids, and providers around. We can really think through what do kids actually need in that moment. If they tell us like, hey, I'm really not doing so great, I am actually considering taking my life, for example, or like I'm really, whatever it may be, struggling, what do they need in that moment? And what can we do right there and then to kind of reduce that risk right there? And then also think about worst case scenario. Okay, if worst case scenario happens, like who should be involved and what do we do there? So really just, again, we really focus on what's the right thing to do here, and then how do we build around that? And that means we can do a bunch with technology and automation, and there's a bunch that we just need a human person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good segue to, as we look at the past decade and beyond, there's been such an increase in anxiety, stress, depression, loneliness, and worst of all, suicide rates, right? So how are you responding to the increase in rates of childhood suicide? Mercedes?
Yeah, that's something that's really concerning to us. And like Dama was saying, we have to ask the hard questions. We know that asking a child about whether they have suicide ideation or suicide thoughts does not lead to higher suicide rates. It actually decreases it. It starts a conversation. They're already thinking about it. They've already heard about it from their friends or from online. So let's ask and start that dialogue. So one of the things we do is we have automated measures and validated measures that we give to our kids to make sure that we can assess. And if we detect anything, we have a process to loop in the parents. We also have, sometimes I think we've leaned too much on, okay, crisis hotlines, and that's your go-to. But actually, there's a lot of other things that can be helpful before that. And we also know hotlines are swamped right now, and there's oftentimes a wait list, or just you wait on the call for a long time, which you can imagine if you're already at risk and having these thoughts, being on hold is not ideal. So we've created, for example, a feature that a child goes through, like, what do they need right now? And they can start figuring out for themselves, is a connection. Who can they call? Is it maybe a family member, a friend? Do they need a laugh and just to distract themselves? Do they need something to calm their body down or to let their feelings out, or to call a hotline? So that's one of the options, but really provide more support And so important is surveillance. That's something that's really important to us and key at Manatee, because we need to respond. We can't just pretend the crisis is not here. Our kids are clearly hurting right now.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because I think a lot of startups wrestle with this, and they take the position of trying to be cautious so that they're mitigating their potential liabilities and other concerns that are out there. I'm curious, Dama, what is your perspective?
Yeah, I think definitely the decisions that we've taken, or the decision that Mercedes and I've taken, like, our lawyers don't always love, quite frankly. But I think, again, I think in certain instances, I think it's the right thing for a company to say, like, you know what, like, this is actually not our expertise. We can't provide value in that area. And then mitigate that risk. Like, make sure that it's very clear that your services are not going to deal with that. But I do feel like if you can provide services and you do provide value for users in that space, not asking the question feels like a cop out to me. But I am also from the Netherlands. We have a much, like, the way that we think about risk liability and kind of the whole suing mentality, like, that doesn't really exist that much there. So I know that I am somewhat unorthodox in my take there. But I think for a company, just evaluate, like, can you actually provide value in that space? If you cannot, mitigate risk. If you can, I think you should provide that value, personally.
The only thing I would add is mitigate risk and then communicate that clearly, right? So parents and kids are aware that you're not a crisis hotline, let's say, or you will not be monitoring what's being inputted there. So just so they know too, being as transparent as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's the only edit you just sparked, like, that I really do think is important too, to that point, is also, like, treat kids, I mean, obviously maintain the regulatory guidelines, but they're also, like, treat them like, quote unquote, little adults, right? Like, they deserve honesty and transparency. And oftentimes they really know well what to do with that information. We can't just shield them from everything, because if we don't talk about it, they'll just make up a narrative in their head. And, like, it becomes way scarier rather than us adults actually talking about the stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. Such an important topic, especially now more than ever. I think we've spent a lot of time talking about youth audience, which has been really important. But I want to switch gears a little bit to thinking about, from a company perspective, what policies, resources, and internal training needs need to be in place for employee mental health. Rita, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks. I think the Manatee team has raised some really interesting points just in general about putting together policies and enforcement strategies. So I'm going to potentially cover some of the similar things that they raised. But I think first, when companies putting together a policy to really understand how to respond to potential suicidal ideation or self-injury and self-harm content on their websites, the first thing is to really look and understand the types of content that they have, and then start engaging right at the beginning with experts in that space who can really help understand what the types of content are and what should potentially stay up and what should potentially come down, and where to involve external agencies if needed. So first, looking at the case studies is really important. The second is really coming together as a company and understanding what your role is. And Dama was just talking about this, and really understanding, is your strength providing clinical help to people, or is really your strength operations and scale and really getting people the right resources right away if there's somebody in need of help? Once you've figured that out, that can really help guide you in what your policy will be and what action you take. Definitely having a close partnership between the people who are the person that's developing your policy and the person who's going to be responding to the policy, which is typically your operations team or operations people, is really important, that they're at the same table working together to make sure that the policy you create is also enforceable and where you can actually take action. And then the other team you really want at the table is your product team, to make sure that you're developing a user reporting flow that can really allow people to report if they see something concerning online and let you know about it. Once you've created your policy, trained your team, The other thing and engaged with external experts to ensure that what you're doing makes sense and really will help your users. The final thing one of the main things to really think about is really the mental health and well-being of your internal teams. This is really difficult content for people to be looking at and seeing. So really having steps and procedures in place to allow for ongoing communication among the team and support, providing services like therapy for team members who are reviewing really difficult content, making sure people have boundaries and can take breaks throughout the day and aren't taking too much work home. These are all really important things to have in place when enacting these types of policies at your company.
Thank you for that, Rita. And Mercedes?
Yeah, and I think I agree with everything Rita said. The only two things that I would add too is flexibility. We're constantly learning and changing. This is a growing and new field. So we're learning more, and kids' vocabulary changes all the time and how they refer to things. So our policies and procedures cannot be stagnant. They have to grow and evolve. So there needs to be a feedback loop with product and ops, all these different teams to make sure we're changing and adapting. And then the other part is also really being mindful of our employees. And so who's reading those messages? And part of the challenge is, as a therapist, on one-on-one, I may know my client and I know their context. When you're just reading something they put in a journal or in a post, we don't have that context. So really being able to know what our threshold is to respond and to escalate. So having a clear process for that is really helpful too.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. I know we have a few minutes left. So one of the last questions that I have is, what's been a big surprise in what you've done? It's interesting to know the journey from startup's perspective. So Alana, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I think in this context, one of the biggest surprises that I faced in probably the last year or so has really just been a result of ramping up research with our users and surveys and talking to our users. We have a Discord community actually that we manage of about 500 like hyper loyal users that engage with the product every day. And so we're tapping into those types of communities and talking to them all the time and learning about what it is that they need, either just personally or from the product. And so that we're having a better understanding of our user persona and how that can be applied in our design and development. I feel like a lot of times companies, we're a small team, and you might think that doing small scale research large scale research with a small cohort of users might not feel like it's a useful thing for you to be doing outside of, you have all these things that you need to build and you have all this marketing that you want to do. But research should be at the core of your product decision making.
Thank you, Alana. And Dama, 30 seconds. What's your perspective?
I think very similar. Obviously, research is key. The two surprising things that I really gathered is we've done a lot of research and thinking about what we think kids want and what they actually want. And like, there's one that I found really kind of crazy, but we have like part of the positive reinforcement and reward setting. A lot of parents just said, my teen or my kid just wants money. They would just want stuff. And like the number one thing that kids actually said is like, I just want like connection and love. I want to do something fun with my parent. I want to hang out as a family. And I just think that a lot of times like parents really underestimate like how much a teen still needs you, or like an older kid still really, really needs you. They may not be like a toddler, but there's that one piece. And then the second thing is, I think, thinking that kids are okay. I think there's often also this misconception, like if my kid doesn't show like real like things, they're fine. But we really see that they often aren't. And there's a lot of internalizing pieces, like, anxiety, like some kid may really show it, the other may not. So we see a lot of times that parents say there's no suicidal ideation or like there's nothing wrong. And actually we then get a bunch of red flags that show that there are issues. So those are my two big takeaways, kind of as a parent and as a founder.
Well, that brings us to the end of this panel. I want to thank you all for talking about from such depth and expertise and living it and breathing it every day. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and expertise here today.